lot of us grew up with this general ambient assumption that science and religion, if they weren't fundamentally at odds, they were at least totally different ways of understanding the world with no connection to one another. And anytime you did science, you had to put your belief aside. And anytime you went to church, you would have to ignore what science was saying about things like the age of the universe and all that stuff. But what you're saying about Isaac Newton is really important, and people are always shocked to discover this. I'm sure you've learned this as well, that when you tell people, oh yeah, Newton was, pouring through biblical genealogies, he was scribbling in the margins of like Genesis 11 and trying to figure out who Noah's sons all were and all of this, they're shocked because Newton has been conscripted into this historical narrative about how the bright blaze of reason burst forth from the nasty regressive church and a theocratic control that had been keeping human knowledge back. And this is really a PR campaign. It's a branding exercise that was invented to justify the notion of the Enlightenment, that there was some kind of light of reason that had burst forth. And again, in France especially, but also in Germany and in England to a lesser extent, this idea that all that superstition stuff is in the past. In order to sustain that idea, there had to be a new story told about history and the history of science especially that we all got told in school. And usually the patient zero is usually Galileo. It's usually the story of Galileo versus Cardinal Bellarmine of the Catholic Church and Pope Urban. And the idea is Galileo found out using purely secular reasoning that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. And the church was very angry about this because something Bible verses, and then they put him under arrest, and this was very evil, but in the end, reason won out. And so after that, of course, anybody after Galileo then gets kind of yoked into this anti-religious enterprise, including Newton, who comes after Galileo, and even, stretching back to Copernicus before Galileo. But basically none of this story is true. Exactly 0% of that account is historically accurate. What you really have at the birth of the scientific revolution is an argument within the church, among Christian believers, about the right way to honor God. And there was a genuine dispute. It was not a religious versus atheist dispute. It was a religious person versus religious person dispute. To a man, every one of the titans of the scientific revolution, Galileo, Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, lesser known guys like Tycho Brahe, they were all religious, and they all believed that their creation, the creation of mankind by God, endows us with certain abilities and burdens us with certain responsibilities, one of which is to use our reason, to know as much about creation as we can discover, because through that we will come to learn and discover about God. The Catholic Church had a slightly different way of looking at this, which is why Galileo ran into trouble. There was more room for mystery in the sort of official Catholic doctrine, and the church was more cautious than Galileo was. Galileo was quite brazen about just barreling forth, even before all of the evidence was really quite in, so they got into this fight. But the after effect, the aftermath of this, was to take Newtonian logic and basically enlisted in a project that had nothing to do with Newton, but everything to do with the French Revolution and the Enlightenment more generally, which was about stripping away tradition. It was extremely anti-tradition and had this idea of human reason as being totally divorced from anything that went before. It was just this pure light of knowledge that humankind was able to access. And the only thing that the past could possibly contribute was a burden of constraint and superstition. And there's a little bit of this in Francis Bacon, but there's a lot of it in the Enlightenment philosophes. And once that becomes the ideology that you are devoted to, every counter-argument has to be explained away. And this includes the religion of the scientific revolutionaries. So people like Newton are portrayed now as having been brilliantly insightful in the scientific sphere, but still sort of unfortunately attached to a little bit of that residual faith. It's as if, this is like that evolutionary picture of man coming out of the apes, this is the way the Enlightenment historians start to tell the story. It's as if science is kind of emerging gradually, but it's still got some of its old religion clinging to it until now we're going to burst forth into the truth. And this was, I think, still what we grew up with. It was part of the new atheist idea that was a big craze when I was growing up. But it's a pure fiction historically that gets invented retroactively, basically to underwrite certain political projects and certain ideological projects that have very little to do with anything that science has actually discovered or revealed.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.